Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. South Africa's democracy, at least compared to Zimbabwe, is very healthy and kicking. What you're about to hear, you would never hear in Zimbabwe. Can you imagine SABC's Ruben Barwe, for instance, questioning Zanu PF calling of MDC or CCC a puppet of the West? This is exactly what this gentleman on SABC is doing, questioning what the ANC government is doing, and questioning the democratic commitment of ANC. Just listen to it.
Instructed its disciplinary committee to halt the DC hearings of former ANC President Jacob Zuma. Meanwhile, ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula has surreptitiously referred to President Zuma and the MK party as rebel breakaway groupings emanating from factions mutating into opposition parties, echoing the words of former ANC President Thabo Mbeki that these actions are of counter-revolutionaries that have infiltrated the ANC. Joining me to comb through these statements is Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, who's a political analyst. Prof, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Those are heavy words. I've never heard them used before in the ANC. Factions mutating into opposition parties, rebel breakaway groupings, all of these sorts of words describing, well, MK and I guess all those who have gone through similar seemingly rites of passage in politics in South Africa are quite heavy-weighted. Is this a sign that the ANC is taking this matter serious?
Good evening, Mr. Dixon. Good evening to your colleagues and good evening to your viewers. First of all, I must say that what is happening currently between the ANC and the MK party is regrettable, more especially because the statements that you are referring to uttered by former President Thabo Mbeki and then the SG of the ANC, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, and you might also have heard other leaders making pronouncements in their campaigns, including the likes of Matthew Polsa and others. So this is regrettable because it is unprovoked. It just comes voluntarily from the leaders. As to why they do it, I'm not too sure. Because under normal circumstances, during an election year, what you do when you go to the electorate, you just market your organization and indicate what we will be able to do, and then, of course, entice them and then persuade them to vote for you. In the case of the ANC, it's even better because it has been in office since 1994. So there are quite a number of things that these leaders can talk about which are positive to the country and to the electorate and say, this is what we've been able to do for you. These are the hurdles where we have not been able to achieve the goals we wanted to achieve, but this is the plan we have in place in the event that will give us a fresh and forget about talking about anybody else.
Staying on that, referring to counter-revolutionaries, the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula has described them as the criminals, the corrupts, the factionalists, and the careerists. In the same briefing, he's had to deal with questions and address the question around its candidate list, which the ANC has had to deal with over the last couple of weeks, which contain people who are fingered in the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. The sentiment is that every time the ANC is on track with its renewal project, that it is the counter-revolutionaries that attempt to derail that, as is the case with the MK party, if that logic is to be taken to its conclusion. Is it then a genuine attempt at taking a renewal message to the electorate if some of the people who are fingered in the Zondo Commission of Inquiry are still members and candidates on your list submitted to Parliament, while you're describing the counter-revolutionaries as the criminals, the corrupt, the factionalists, and the careerists?
You know, Mr. Dixon, in English, there is this word we call diction, which means the choice and usage of words. In times like this, whoever makes public statements have to be extra careful as to what message that person is conveying. The terms that we are referring to, which are cited from the SG of the ANC, are unwarranted. And in fact, they are dangerous in the sense that they have the potential to arouse emotions unnecessarily. Because at one point, some weeks ago, the same SG of the ANC referred to MK Party not as a political party, but as a project. I remember asking the question, is this an indictment on the IEC that it registered a project and not a political party? In the event that the answer is in the affirmative, what action has been taken against the IEC to say you were supposed to register political parties and independent candidates, but instead you registered a project? That was never followed up. So now you hear these terms that you are referring to, which in fact are denigrating in a way, in the sense that these parties, all of them, they've signed a pact with the IEC saying that we are going to behave ourselves well through what we say and through what we do, so that we ensure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. So the moment then we hear such statements in public, then we get concerned as to what the reaction will be. And then if the other parties feel aggrieved and then make the same statements, what will the end result be? So that is unnecessary in my view.
Yeah. The ANC SG in that briefing has also said that they have instructed the ANC's disciplinary committee to halt the hearing of the disciplinary hearing of President Jacob Zuma to a later date yet to be determined, presumably after the elections. But at the same time...
Well, I'll stop it there. The important thing for Zimbabweans is that here is SABC, the equivalent of ZBC in Zimbabwe, questioning ANC political machinations. What ANC is doing here is trying to denigrate former President Jacob Zuma and his new party because they are a threat to ANC's continued hold on power. In Zimbabwe, this is a very familiar thing. In fact, that has become the norm in Zimbabwe ever since our independence. But you will never, ever hear any ZBC reporter take Zanu PF to task on issues like that. But it's happening here. This is the subtle difference between an independent media and a captured media as in Zimbabwe. What ANC is doing is not surprising at all. ANC has been in power in South Africa since 1994, 30 years now. And although the country has held to its democratic values, there is definitely an independent press, media. The judiciary is independent, the police is independent, and all the various public institutions are independent. Nonetheless, you can see that ANC has been pushing because it has been losing political ground. After 30 years in power, there is no denying that the South African economy has not done well. In the Al Jazeera Gold Mafia documentary, ANC government, although it was not named as government, but complacency was implied in that documentary, that corruption in South Africa is rampant. Indeed, former President Jacob Zuma lost his power because he he had been involved in so many corrupt cases. We all remember the Gupta brothers. And that has lost ANC a lot of support, political support. And ANC has been trying to claw back by doing exactly what Zanu PF has done in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, it is quite normal that Zanu PF would label any of his political rivals by all manner of names. The most common one being a puppet of the West. They will come up with all manner of allegations. The West is funding the opposition. And yet, Zanu PF itself has been funded by outsiders ever since the country's independence. The regime has never agreed to political parties having an audit of their political funding during campaigning periods. Because if that was to happen, Zanu PF would be in serious trouble. The source of their funding has been one of those dark clouds. Even soon after independence, it was quite normal to hear that Zanu PF has received millions of dollars from such companies as Londro. And yet, if the opposition received even a few $1,000s, the regime will be all over the opposition like a rush. This has been the problem with Zimbabwe. The media itself has helped to keep Zanu PF's misdeeds concealed while going to town to discredit the opposition. And here we have got a media that is questioning that. This is absolutely important. I think South Africa's saving grace is that they have democratic institutions. And through all these turbulent years, they have managed to keep those democratic institutions independent. Another interesting thing here is that ANC is talking of holding a disciplinary hearing of its own former President Zuma. President Zuma has been out of office for a number of years now, ever since President Ramaphosa took over. Why haven't they held their party disciplinary hearings on him? They didn't. The only time that they have really woken up is when President Zuma formed this MK party, which is contesting elections on the 29th of May. And this has wound up ANC. Now they're calling him all manner of names. This in Zimbabwe is quite common. Zanu PF has called the opposition all manner of names, And even those who were former Zanu PF cadres, when they've broken away to form their own party and challenge the regime, they have not been spared. The talk of Edgar Tekere, Dr. Simbama Koni, Joyce Mujuru, and many others, former Zanu PF cadres, that the minute they leave the party, they are considered the public enemy number one. And the difference here is the media, the judiciary, all the state institutions join force with Zanu PF because they are Zanu PF in all but name. I'm looking forward to these elections because I think it will once again underline that South Africa, while it has had its fair share of problems, I think it has the ability to transform itself. Because as long as the institutions remain independent, they will hold those in positions of power and authority to account. In our case in Zimbabwe, that's the one blessing we never had. Soon after independence, Mugabe moved in very quickly to promote and replace all key individuals in the key institutions with Zanu PF party faithfuls who transformed those institutions into Zanu PF departments in all but name. Just before I close, I think I would like to refer to ANC. In November 2022, they held their party congress in which they made a resolution that ANC would not allow regime change in Zimbabwe because they had come to the conclusion that the sanctions were imposed for the sake of forcing regime change. As much as one can accept the sanctions, and while some people would still argue the sanctions are imposed by the West for the sake of producing regime change, one cannot also deny that in Zimbabwe, Zanu PF has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. The fight in Zimbabwe was for free, fair, and credible elections. If one can then say the sanctions were imposed to disrupt that, that is an argument that the ANC has failed to present. The argument that was there is Zanu PF has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And to justify rigging elections on the basis that there are sanctions is unsustainable. Why should an ordinary Zimbabwean, who had nothing to do with the imposition of sanctions, when the Americans, the European Union imposed those sanctions, they never consulted the ordinary Zimbabwean. Why should that ordinary Zimbabwean be denied their fundamental right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country because there are sanctions? It doesn't make any sense. And it is important to remind our ANC friends that Zimbabwe, Zanu PF has been rigging elections long before the sanctions were imposed. The sanctions were imposed in 2001. And yet Zanu PF has rigged elections going back to 1980. As it happened, SADC's own election observer team, the African Union's own election observer team, condemned Zimbabwe's 2023 elections as being flawed and illegal. There is no doubt that SADC should have stepped in and denied Zanu PF legitimacy on the basis of that report, but they did not. Well, we'll never know the full story. But South Africa being the dominant country in SADC, and ANC having made their resolution in November 2022, saying that they will not allow regime change in Zimbabwe. ANC leaders, including President Cyril Ramaphosa and the Secretary General of ANC, were among the top leaders who congratulated Mnangagwa for winning the 2023 elections. And they attended his inauguration when everybody else was saying this is not right. So I think it is fair to say that without South Africa's support, at least SADC would have felt the pressure to deny Zanu PF legitimacy. So as it happened, although SADC has not officially endorsed those elections and endorsed Zanu PF's legitimacy, their silence is taken as approval in this case. And ANC cannot deny that they played a part in that. As a Zimbabwean, one cannot deny that ANC did the people of Zimbabwe a great disservice. And it is tragic that they did that, because Zimbabwe now is stuck with a corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical regime. Zimbabwe is a pariah state. And as long as we remain a pariah state, our hopes of meaningful economic recovery are very slim indeed. Who would want to do business in a country where corruption is so rampant, where political instability is the norm? I would like to wish the people of South Africa, and so far, touch wood, they've had a peaceful election period. And I hope they will have, this will continue and culminate in a peaceful election, and they will have free, fair, and credible elections again, which, to be fair to all South Africans, which they've managed to do these last 30 years. I think is something to be admired, to be commended. And I hope whichever government emerges out of that will have the support of the people of South Africa, the democratic mandate to rule that country. And I hope that the new government will take South Africa in a new and more exciting direction. The last 30 years, there is nothing to be admired there. South Africa has had many of the same problems that Zimbabwe has had. Load shedding being one of them because of poor planning. Corruption has also been rampant, which hasn't helped that country at all. I hope the new government that will emerge will start addressing those serious problems. And while Zimbabwe is we are having our own problems, I don't see why I should wish anything else for South Africa. I wish them all the very best. And I salute the South African media for remaining resolutely independent. I think I'll just play the last bit of this video for those of you who were following it as well.
The same briefing also says that the ANC Disciplinary Committee is entirely an independent organization free of influence. One might ask if instructing the ANC Integrity Committee to withhold or to halt the disciplinary hearing, meanwhile, while saying that they're independent, are those two things mutually inclusive, or is there somewhat of a tense contradiction there?
Mr. Dixon, there is contradiction. And in fact, there are things that don't add up here. One question we need to ask is, what is the nature of the relationship between the NEC of the ANC, the top six of the ANC on the one hand, and then, of course, on the other hand, the NDC of the ANC? If there is open lines of communication, the question then becomes, when did the NDC decide to summon the former president to appear before it on Tuesday? If that decision was taken as a collective decision with the NEC, then of course we shouldn't be where we are. If indeed the NDC is a separate entity or an independent body, then they shouldn't be getting an instruction from the ANC as to what to do. So there is something that doesn't add up. It's either the lines of communication are not open, or there is something that you and I don't know, which only the SG and of course the chair of the NDC might be in a better position to answer.
Can one account as an instruction on when or when not to hold your disciplinary hearing as a material instruction that can influence the outcome, or is it merely a cosmetic instruction for operational purposes?
Whether it's for operational purposes, it doesn't really matter. The reality here is you have an NDC, which is supposed to be an independent entity. Of course, it works under the ANC, but then at no point can it take instructions from the ANC. So if this was presented to the NDC as a suggestion, we have done an assessment, government has done an assessment, and we're of the view that there might be political violence. Then you present that to the NDC, and then we let them make a determination. But then if it comes as an instruction, we have done our spade work, then we're giving you an instruction, put this a disciplinary hearing on hold until further notice. Then, of course, this empowers the NDC, which might then give you questions as to whether it has teeth to bite or if it is indeed an independent entity.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I think the other important bit there I would like to quickly mention before I close is that there was serious concern about something that could result in violence, particularly during the campaigning period. And that is important. In Zimbabwe, Zanu PF has been the instigator of violence. They have provoked violence. And that is another thing. And in South Africa, we have heard the police saying they are there to make sure that there is law and order, regardless of who wins at the end of the day. The commitment to maintain peace and order, law and order in South Africa is there. I really would like to emphasize that point. I think South Africa has been extremely lucky, and I think this is Nelson Mandela's greatest legacy to that country. He left them with working democratic institutions. Unlike Zimbabwe, Mugabe left the country with no working democratic institution. All of them had been corrupted because he was committed to consolidating Zanu PF's hold on power, and that's all he cared about. And our friend, we came after him. His commitment to hanging on to power was no different. It is a great pity that our opposition, our main opposition, had the golden opportunity to implement the reforms and end this culture of violence, of tyrannical rule. Unfortunately, they wasted that opportunity. Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of high office, and in return, they forgot about the reforms. We have got a lot of building up to do in Zimbabwe, but I hope we are learning some important lessons from across the Limpopo. ANC did not do us any favors at all these last 5-10 years. And I'm glad to see that in South Africa, while there have been moves to try to do the same, the institutions there have stood strong and stopped ANC destroying that country. I think South Africa will be served by the country's democratic institutions. And the people themselves will be able to act, take the necessary democratic actions, make the necessary democratic choices to save that country from the fate that has befallen countries like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, for 44 years, we have failed to hold those in positions of power to account. And that's why Zimbabwe is a failed state. Thank you very much for the listeners out there, and to everybody else. Thank you for listening, and good night.